Okay, so are you in Hebrews chapter 3? We have been in a sermon series studying verse by verse this entire book, and I've called the entire sermon series Seeing Jesus as Jesus Is. And the title of this morning's sermon is Follow God or Else. Follow God or else. By the way, does it seem like we've been hitting on the same topic now for like 3 weeks straight? It just seems like it's just kind of over and over and over. We're driving home this message of just being faithful and following God week after week and moving forward and maturing in your faith. And while we may be studying the same topic week after week, man, I simply want to remind you that it's not like I can just kick my feet up and be like, we'll just ditto from last Sunday, right? There's some new things that we're learning each Sunday that we're together. And as we're expounding on this topic of persevering in your faith, this idea of don't quit, don't give up in your faith. And let's also be reminded this morning that the book of Hebrews is one continuous letter. It's one long message. And so it shouldn't be surprising then that there are sections that are going to be dealing with the same topic over and over and over. And so the message, the overall message of Hebrews is don't stop, persevere in your faith. Don't just come to the cross and lay down and quit. That's not what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to mature in our faith and continue on and to grow. And each of us can find that we have room for improvement in that regard, right? I hope so. And so maybe these sermons are resonating with you, and maybe they're really kind of hitting home, and you can kind of take an honest assessment of your life and realize, hey, look, I've got some room for improvement. There's some things in my life that I can definitely change. There's some areas that need a greater concentration of my efforts, and I just really haven't been putting in the time. Today can be the day where that changes for you. Hey, when you were a kid and you were in school and you went to the playground, did you ever get into like fights on the playground? Just me? Okay. Mine usually happened over kickball, right? And I was pretty competitive as a kid and playing kickball on the playground and certain rules that had to be followed. And when I felt like those rules weren't being followed, or if I felt like the call was unfair, it ensued in an argument, which hopefully didn't always ensue in a fight, but sometimes it did, right? And if you ever found yourself involved in an argument or a fight on the playground, didn't it always kind of go this way? Maybe, you get into an argument and you're disagreeing, and then it leads to like physical. It leads to like a shove. And you're like, hey, knock it off. And the other person get in your face and be like, and if I don't? And you'd be like, you don't want to find out. And they'd be like, is that a threat? And then it would always end this way. That's not a threat. See, you guys did fight on the playground. I knew it. Okay? It's not a threat. It's a promise. Now, what we've come to realize in our adult life is that threats don't always work too well. They worked even great with your kids when they were little, but when they got too old to really, be scared of the threat anymore, right? Then we find that threats really don't work that well. But here's the thing about threats, and here's the thing about declaring a message. When we first wanted to get a message across, it was kind of a threatening message, right? But then the older we got, we realized that, that doesn't work so well. But the message is still important, and so I still need you to understand the importance of this message. But I changed it from a threat to a warning. And that's really what we see happening here in the book of Hebrews. Think about it this way. If you turn on the weather and the sky looks a little pukish green outside, and the weatherman on your TV tells you, hey, a tornado has been spotted in your area, seek shelter immediately. We don't get offended by that, right? We don't call that a threat. What do we call that? A warning. And that's really what today's message is. It's a warning to keep following God or else. And that's not a threat. That's not a threat. It's a warning. So are you in Hebrews chapter 3, starting in verse 16? this is where we're going to start with our text this morning. There's no excuse for unbelief. The Bible makes it clear that each of us is headed to an appointment with God. It's called judgment. And we're going to stand one day before God. And it's probably a good thing to know up front that as we stand there before God, there is no excuse that we can offer to God that He's going to be like, oh, okay, I get it now. There's no reason that you can give to God to justify your desire, your decision to not believe what God has told you. And beginning here in Hebrews chapter 3, verse 16, there's 3 rhetorical questions that are asked. And then at the end of the chapter, it's answered in one summarizing statement. So let's begin here, Hebrews chapter 3, verse 16. And before we jump in here, I want to give you some background of what's going on. If you remember, the book of Hebrews is written to who? Jewish Christians. These are Christians who have used to be Jews who have converted to following Jesus, and that's what they're doing, right? They're following Jesus. And so the Hebrews author is going to kind of give some illustrations, some connecting points to them, and he's going to be talking about when these Israelites were being led by Moses from Egypt into the Promised Land. Okay, so let's pick it up here in verse 16. For who provoked God when they had heard the message? Remember last week, if you were here, we studied Numbers chapter 14, and God was telling about how He was going to lead the Israelites to this promised land, and how close they were, that Moses had led them, and after spending time at Mount Sinai, led them on to the promised land. They were on the edge of the promised land. They send 12 scouts out to go look at the promised land. They come back and they give the report. You remember how that went? 10 came back and said, man, we can't do it. The enemies living there are too big, too powerful. We can't overtake them. And then 2 messengers, 2 spies, 2 scouts came back and said, yes, we can do it. God's with us. He's bigger than our enemies. And you remember that these Israelites who were like so close to the promised land that they could see the milk and almost taste the honey, they refused to follow God into the promised land any further. And why did they do that? Because they questioned God's motives when the scouts brought back the report of enemies living in the land. So make a note of this. You can't blame ignorance for your unbelief. Did you catch it there? It said, who had provoked him when they had heard? The Israelites heard the message, hey, there's a land flowing with milk and honey, and God's going to give it to you. But they decided not to do that. They decided not to follow Him into the promised land. They had been given every reason to believe that God was powerful. They had seen miracle after miracle being performed. And yet they were stubborn in their choosing to not believe and follow where God was leading. God made it crystal clear what His intentions were for His children. God made it crystal clear what His expectations were for His children. And yet, they said, no, we're not going to do that. And look, you and I, we can't blame ignorance either. You and I can't be like, well, I didn't know where God was leading me because He really didn't make it clear. I didn't know what God expected of me because God didn't really make it very clear to me. Remember back in our first sermon in this series, back in Hebrews chapter 1, verses 1 through 3, the very first sermon that we studied in this book, remember what the title of it was? God Speaks. And we learned that He spoke, yes, long ago through the prophets in many portions in many ways, but now He has spoken through His Son Jesus. And so yes, God spoke a long time ago, but He still speaks and He still wants to speak and He still is speaking. I think the problem isn't that God isn't speaking. I think the problem is that we have the noise in our lives cranked up to a volume where we just find it more difficult to listen to what God is saying. You can't blame ignorance. You can't say, well, I didn't know. I didn't know what God wanted me to do. No. You've heard. You've understood what God wants you to do. Exactly like the Israelites understood where God wanted them to go. So you can't blame ignorance. Look what else you can't blame. You can't blame your leaders for your unbelief. Look at the last half of verse 16. For who provoked him when they had heard? Indeed, did not all those who came out of Egypt, led by Moses? You see, the Israelites, if you remember, were given this tremendous leader in Moses. And remember last week when we studied together that these Israelites like almost elevated Moses to a godlike status. Now, was Moses perfect? Absolutely not. He was human. But Moses devoted his life to leading people where God was leading, where God was directing. And so it wasn't going to fly for these Israelites to say, well, the reason that we missed out on the promised land was because Moses was such a lousy leader. That's not going to fly. And you can't blame your lack of unbelief or your unbelief on lousy leaders. Okay? And there's some who would do that. There are some who would be like, well, you know what, my preacher just doesn't really, he's not all that exciting, kind of dull, kind of boring, I'm not going to go to church, and, well, you know, so on and so forth. It's not going to work. You can't blame ignorance, you can't blame your leaders. Look at the third thing you can't blame. You can't blame others for your unbelief. Look at verses 17 and 18. And with whom was God angry for 40 years? Was it not with those who sinned, whose bodies fell in the wilderness? And to whom did he swear that they would not enter his rest, but to those who were disobedient? You see what those verses are saying? God judges the individual. It's the individual's responsibility. That's what he's saying. And so each individual is going to be held accountable for their own disbelief. Now, it would appear as though on the surface that God judged the entire nation as a group, right? That he's like a teacher that graded on the curve, and, you know, I'm going to judge the entire class based on the performance of a few. And that's not what God did at all. He judged them based upon their own individual unbelief. And how do I know that? Because he condemned an entire generation, but in that generation, there were two that didn't get condemned. Do you remember who the two were that didn't get condemned, who got to see the promised land? Joshua and Caleb, right? Well, if God was going to condemn all of them based on the actions, there's just a few, Joshua and Caleb shouldn't see the promised land. But that's not how God operates. He always holds accountable individuals for their own actions. And so you can't blame your lack of unbelief on somebody else. You can't be like, well, it was my parents' fault. You should have seen the household I was raised in. I didn't know any better. They said they were Christians, but they treated me lousy, so I shunned religion. I shunned Christianity. You can't blame your unbelief on somebody else. Make sense? And I know that there are people in church today who blame some person in the church who hurt their feelings. Or maybe some preacher who did something or said something that was insensitive to them. And I got to tell you, if that's where you were at or where you used to be, then you have to understand that's not going to fly when you get to the judgment day and you're standing before God and you'll be like, well, God, this is why I chose not to follow. Because there were some things that happened in my life. God's going to be like, that doesn't fly. You are held accountable for your own decisions and your own actions. You can't blame ignorance. You can't blame your leaders. You can't blame others. And see what the author of Hebrews does now here in verse 19. He sums it all up in a single word. So we see now that they were not able to enter. Why? Because of unbelief. It's unbelief. People will be condemned and miss out on the promised land of heaven because of their own choosing not to believe. It's not because you haven't heard who God is and what He expects of you. It's not because your Christian leader isn't good enough. It's not because your circumstances that you find yourself in are so tough and difficult. What does God say that it is? All those things? It's unbelief. Well, let's move on to some good news. And here's the good news. There may be no excuse for unbelief, but here's the good news. It's not too late to change. Let's turn the page now to Hebrews chapter 4, beginning in verse 1. It reads, "Therefore let us fear if, while a promise remains of entering His rest, any one of you may seem to have come short of it. Let me just back up here and talk about that word rest just for a moment. The first time that this word rest is used in the book of Hebrews is back in chapter 3. And it was referring to the land that God promised to give to the Israelites. Remember that? They talked about this promised land as being their rest. And it was really this land, this promised land that God ultimately committed to give to them. The reason it was called their rest was because for 400 plus years they had been slaves in Egypt. And what do slaves do? Man, you work. You work like a dog. And you're punished and you're abused and you're beaten up and you're worn out. And God is basically saying that, look, I'm going to give you some rest, and it's going to come in the promised land. You're going to have a land that belongs to you, and no one's going to be your master except me. Later on in the New Testament, when Jesus shows on the scene, what's he do? He offers the invitation. Come to me, all who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Right? Okay. So, ultimately, the word rest refers to the paradise that will be experienced when the follower of Jesus dies. But here in the book of Hebrews chapter 3, the rest is also referring to the promised land that was given to the Israelites. And what we're going to see here played out is how much better and far superior the rest of heaven is going to be compared to the rest found in the promised land. Therefore, let us fear if, while a promise remains of entering his rest, any one of you may seem to have come short of it. Now, here in the following verses, the author of Hebrews gives 3 requirements, 3 things that are needed in order for you and I to enter into our rest. Okay? And you got to keep in mind, he's using an illustration of the promised land, and he's using this illustration to point out and say, this is what was needed for the Israelites to enter into the promised land. And so this is not an exhaustive list. Does that make sense? I think it will once we get into it. So there's 3 things that the author of Hebrews is like, hey, this was needed to get into the promised land, but this is also needed to get into heaven. Okay, he's making this correlation. And the first thing that is needed, if you want to enter into God's rest, is a fear of not going to heaven. That's needed. Did you notice what our text says? Therefore, let us fear if any one of you may seem to have come short of it. Come short of what? Getting to heaven. And if you are in danger of not getting into heaven, that should cause great fear to come upon you. Because ultimately what happens when we fall short of entering his rest, when we fall short of entering into heaven, we enter into a place of torment. That place is called hell. What do you know about hell? The Bible has a lot to say about it. It's a real place. It's a place of torment. It's a place of pain. The Bible says that in hell there is weeping. The Bible says that in hell there is gnashing of teeth. The Bible describes hell as being as darkness and a separation from God. What kind of God would send people to hell? Maybe you've heard that question. Maybe you've asked that question. I thought God was loving. He wouldn't send anybody to hell, would he? What kind of God would send someone to hell? I'll tell you what kind of God. A holy God. A just God. A God that demands that sin be punished. A God deserving of respect and fear. And you say, well, I don't know that I want to worship that kind of God. Okay, then, worship whatever kind of God you want to make up for yourself, and we'll see how that works out for you come Judgment Day. The shocking thing is not that there is a hell. The shocking thing is that there's a heaven. That somehow this holy God did for us what we could not do for ourselves. I think if we got down to the nitty-gritty, I think each and every one of us would have to examine our lives and realize that each and every one of us is deserving of hell. That's what we deserve. And the amazing thing is that God has created a heaven for you and for me to spend eternity with him. That somehow this holy God sent his holy Son into history to live a perfect, unblemished, sinless life, to ultimately become the payment for sin for you and for me, so that God could justly forgive you and you could receive heaven. That's what's amazing. That's what's shocking. And the place where that starts is fear. It's a fear of not getting to heaven. It's a fear of not getting to be where God is at. That's where salvation begins, right? How many of you came to know Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior first because of fear? Man, I was there. I was in the 5th grade, and I remember it so vividly. We were having a revival at our church, and E. Ray Cotton Jones was the evangelist. And I grew up as the son of a preacher. And I remember at the end of that sermon, E. Ray Cotton Jones said this: if you were to die tonight, where would you spend eternity? And that thought scared me. Fear, the Bible tells us, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of what? Wisdom, right? A fear of not being able to be where God is at should be prompting you to enter into His rest. Let me illustrate it this way. You guys ever watch The Office? You guys watch The Office? I watch The Office. Michael Scott. He's like the boss of The Office, and he's an idiot. But sometimes Michael Scott says some pretty profound things. And I think this quote from Michael Scott could also be something that I think is a desire of God. Michael Scott, he was asked, would I rather be feared or loved? Both. I want people to be afraid of how much they love me. And isn't that true? I think the same could be said for God, that when I first came to God, it was out of fear for what would happen to me. Oh, I don't want to go to hell. I'm going to come to God. But now as I've grown in my relationship, as I've matured in my faith, there's no longer a fear that exists there. Remember, perfect love casts out what? Fear, right? So that fear of going to hell no longer exists for me. Now what remains, now what exists is my love for Him. That I love Him because He first loved me. And that's astonishing to me. And now fear is no longer my motivation for coming to church. Fear is no longer my motivation for reading the Bible and praying. What's my motivation now? Love. But first, you have to have a fear of missing out in order to enter the rest. Does that make sense? In order to enter God's rest. A fear of not going there is where it starts. But then it matures into something that's called love. Here's the second thing that entering God's rest requires, based upon our text: actions congruent with what you believe. Actions in line with your faith. Now remember, the author of Hebrews is talking to Jewish Christians, these Jews who had decided to follow Jesus. And so there's this comparison that is being made to the Israelites who were following Moses to get to the promised land. But there was a bunch of them who missed the promised land. And why did they miss the promised land? Because they failed to trust God's goodness. They said they believed that God was good. They said they believed in God. But when it came time to put their faith into action, they fell short. Listen to what it says here in verses 2 and 3. For indeed, we have had good news preached to us, just as they did also. Who's the they also? The Israelites. They had the message that said, hey, there's a land flowing with milk and honey. Come on, it's this way, go. They had good news preached to them. But it did not profit them. Why? Why didn't it profit them? Because it was not united by faith in those who heard. In other words, they heard the good news. There's a promised land waiting for you. It's flowing with milk and honey. But that good news didn't do those Israelites any good. You know why? Because they didn't have actions that were in line with what they professed to believe. If they truly believed God was who He said He was, they would have followed Him anywhere He was leading, regardless of who was living in the promised land at the time. For we who have believed, verse 3, for we who have believed entered that rest, just as He said, as I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest, although His works were finished from the foundation of the world. See, it's not enough to simply say, I believe. That's like saying, oh, I hope so. You must have actions that would demonstrate your faith. You must have actions to back up or that are congruent with what you profess to believe. Let me illustrate it this way. It's a silly illustration. But if I were to say to you that I believe the Detroit Lions are going to win the Super Bowl in 2021. By the way, they have not won a Super Bowl ever since the creation of the franchise was made, right? But if I said, I believe the Lions are going to go to the Super Bowl next year, other Lions fans would be like, well, I hope so. But that's not faith. And if I really believe that, if I really wanted to profess what I believe, that I said the Lions are going to the Super Bowl, well, then it would change the way that I would act, right? I mean, I would definitely plan to attend a few games next football season, right? I'd want to watch that. I'd want to see that with my own eyes. I would definitely make plans to be in Tampa, Florida, which is where the Super Bowl is going to be hosted in 2021. I would definitely purchase some Lions gear. And if I really believed it, there'd be some things that I would also do differently. I wouldn't be so critical of the team's management or the coaches. And I wouldn't be so upset if they lost a game here or lost a game there. Because I know that the Lions are going to win the Super Bowl. And if I truly believed the Detroit Lions were going to win the Super Bowl, then guess what else would happen? You wouldn't be able to shut me up about it. Right? I'd be so excited. I'd be telling everybody and anybody who's going to listen, Lions are winning the Super Bowl this year. Maybe that doesn't resonate with you. Maybe this will. If we heard the smoke alarm going off here this morning in this building, you would believe that you heard the smoke alarm. It rang in your ears. You would be like, yep, that's the smoke alarm. But would you have actions that were congruent with what you believed? Would you believe that the building was on fire? Would you exit the building very quickly, grabbing your loved ones, making sure they were all safe? Would you have actions that were in line with what you profess to believe? Or would you just sit there and be like, yeah, wish somebody would turn that thing off. It's kind of annoying. You have to have actions that are congruent with your faith, with what you believe. So now from the silly to the serious. There's going to be a lot of people who are separated for all of eternity from God because they said they believed that Jesus was the Son of God. They hoped that there was a heaven, but their lives did not reflect what they said they believed. Their actions were not in line with what they claimed to believe. Now I'm asking, do you believe in your heart that God is real and that heaven is real and that Jesus Christ died for your sins? If you do, you're going to have some actions that would demonstrate what you believe to be true. This is best summed up in James chapter 2, verse 14 through 18. What use is it then, my brethren, if someone says he has faith but he has no works? Can that faith save him? If a brother or sister is without clothing and in need of daily food, and one of you says to them, go in peace, be warm, and be well fed, and yet you do not give them what is necessary for their body, what use of that is that to them? Even so, faith, if it has no works, is dead, being by itself. But someone may well say, you have faith and I have works. Show me your faith without works, and I will show you my faith by my works. What James is basically saying there in those verses is this, that you can say you believe that you're a Christian all day long, but if you don't have actions that back up what you profess to believe, your faith without works is dead. That's what he's saying. So do you see what's necessary to ensure that you don't miss out on God's rest, that you don't miss out on heaven? The fear of missing out of it. Actions congruent with faith. And here's the third thing that our Hebrews author compares to it as well that says it's needed. A sense of urgency. The urgency to decide is today. And this thing about following Christ is something that you need to act on as soon as possible. If you've never given your life to Christ, today is the day of salvation. If you've been wandering or drifting in regards to your decision of following Christ, come back to Him. When? Today. The message of urgency is sprinkled all throughout Hebrews chapter 4. Verse 7, it uses the word today. Verse 12, it talks about today. Verse 15, it talks about today. Today, 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 today. When are we supposed to do this again? I'm not really sure. Today. Verses 4 through 7. Let me read these for you. For he has said somewhere concerning the seventh day, and God rested on the seventh day from all of his works. And again in this passage, they shall not enter my rest. Therefore, since it remains for some to enter it, by the way, let me just pause right there. That's some good news. It's not too late. We can still make some changes in our life to make sure that we enter into heaven. Therefore, since it remains for some to enter it, and those who formerly had good news preached to them failed to enter because of disobedience, he again fixes a certain day, today, saying through David after so long a time as just been before, today if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. Now that's kind of a long, twisting road, but don't miss the urgency. It's today. So putting it all together, it's not too late to change. And if you want to change, do it today. There's no excuse for unbelief. It's not too late to change. And finally, listen to what our text tells us. We've not arrived yet. You ever been on a long trip with your kids? Are we there yet? Are we there yet? Are we there yet? No, we're not. And such an important attitude is needed for the Christian to have on this journey. So many of us treat our spiritual journey as though that when we came to the cross of Jesus Christ, that somehow that was the destination. That's the beginning. And somehow after we come to the cross, we just find ourselves sitting on our hands, twiddling our thumbs, flipping pages on a calendar until we get to heaven. But our text makes it plain that we have not arrived, that it's not over yet, that this thing is not finished. And our text first states this truth, that heaven is up ahead. Look at verse 8. For if Joshua had given them rest, God would not have spoken of another day after that. You see what it's saying here? This is saying that the promised land isn't the real rest that God had in mind for his children. That's not where you're going to find rest. It's not going to be here on this planet. Okay? That there is a rest that's coming. That the real rest is later on. It's up ahead and it's heaven. Hey, what do you know about heaven? We've talked about hell. Let's talk about heaven. Heaven is real. And it's going to be great. And it's described in Revelation chapter 21 verse 4. It says of Jesus that Jesus will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and there will no longer be any death. There will no longer be any mourning or crying or pain, for the first things have passed away. Do you know somebody in heaven? You know somebody who's experiencing that kind of eternity today? They're having a great day today, let me tell you. And I look forward to that day. You? A place where there's no more pain, no more separation, no more death, no more funerals, no more funeral homes, no more mourning. I think we're all ready for that. But here's the thing, not yet. That's up ahead. Here's the second thing to make note of. That while heaven is up ahead, that means that there's still work to be done. Look at verses 9 and 10. So there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God, for the one who has entered his rest has himself also rested from his works, as God did from his. So this is making the comparison of God and the day of creation. Remember back in Genesis chapter 1, God spent 6 consecutive days creating everything that you see. And what did he do on his 7th day? He rested. But he didn't rest until the work was what? Done. And then he's saying that, listen, there is a Sabbath rest. There is some rest that you and I get to enjoy, that you and I get to appreciate. But it hasn't happened yet. And until we enter that rest, there's still work to be done. How do I know there's still work to be done? Because you're not dead yet. That's how I know there's still work to be done. And so when you think about your calendar this week, and as you're making plans this week of what you're going to do, here's a great thing to ask yourself. Am I going to work for God this week? I think so many of us are so diligent to plan out our days and our evenings, and our schedules are so jam-packed, tight, filled with things that we want to do. And we forget that our purpose here on earth is to serve Him, to expand His kingdom, to work for Him until He comes back or calls us home. That is our priority. That is our concern. There is still work yet to do. Heaven is up ahead. There's still work to be done. Here's the final thing. Verse 11 says, don't stop now. Don't stop now. Verse 11, therefore let us be diligent to enter that rest, so that no one will fall through following the same example of disobedience. What's the same example of disobedience that he's talking about here? It's the example of the Israelites and their failure to enter the promised land because they flat out disobeyed and flat out didn't do what God was asking them to do. And so an entire generation of people failed to believe in God, and they failed to enter the rest that God was wanting to provide them. That word diligent that's used there, the word means make every effort, to strive, to struggle, do your best. It's a great word. Are you giving your best to the Master? Don't stop now. I know you're tired. I know it's hard. I know you're frustrated and worn out and you're discouraged because, man, you've lost somebody close to you and they're no longer here. You're not done yet. And there's work still to be done. Don't stop now. You're this close. You can see the land flowing with milk. You can smell the honey, but you're not there yet. Be diligent to enter that rest. So as we wrap up, 3 journal questions for you to consider. Do you have any excuses in your life that you've used as a reason for your unbelief? Is God asking you to go somewhere that's challenging for you, and you're like, I don't know that I can follow you, God, and you've got some excuses that you're offering in place of faithfulness? You're like, I would go be a missionary for you, I would go back to Bible college and train, but I've got a family to provide for. I can't do that. Are you offering some excuses, whatever it may be, to what God is asking you to do, for your failure, your refusal to do what God has asked you to do? Second, do you have any actions that would seem to contradict what you believe? Do you have any actions that would seem to contradict what you say you believe? Now here's the thing. Each and every one of us have got actions in our lives that contradict what we say we believe. We call that sin. And everybody in this room has got some sin in their life, okay? But what I'm asking you to do with this question is to identify that sin, to confess it to the Lord as sin. And guess what He's willing and faithful to do? He's willing and faithful to forgive you of your sin. And finally, are you diligently working for God's kingdom, fulfilling His purposes in your life? We've talked about this for a few weeks now, that you have a calling, that God is asking you specifically as an individual to do some things that He's not asked anybody else to do. He's asked you to do some things that only you can do. I can't do them. Nobody else in this room can do them. Only you can do them. Are you diligently working for God's kingdom, fulfilling His purposes for your life? Those are the 3 questions that I want you to wrestle with and let the Spirit speak to you this week as you journal through those.